Lovely. Thank you so much, Bruno. Well, as always, being a researcher and scholar, it's wonderful to have a deadline to really kick things into gear. So this will actually be a component of my forthcoming monograph that I have yet to really break ground upon. But this obviously forms kind of the introductory chapter, if you will. Without any dispute, art historians attribute Kamaluddin Bihzad as the preeminent artist of Turco-Persianate arts of the book, or Persian miniature painting, as it is colloquially called. The painter gets lots of attention and is credited with fine masterpieces, but his actual biography is obscure. Scholars are keen to establish his movements and chronicle his career in the splendiferous court of the Timurid ruler Sultan Hussein Mirza Baykara in Herat. There, in the 1480s and 90s, the artist administered the esteemed kitabkhane, or workshop, and then served new Abū'l-Khairid patrons, more commonly known as Shaybanid Uzbeks, when the important center switched hands and came under their control between 1507 and 1510. After this, Bihzad and his family may have been whisked away to Tabriz by Safavid armies of Shah Ismail, where the artist was hidden in a cave in 1514 to avoid capture by the Ottomans during the Battle of Chaldiran. This was all before he oversaw magnificent projects in the Royal Safavid Kitabkhane starting in 1522. He either died and was buried beside the esteemed poet Kamal Khojandi, who predeceased him in the Safavid capital Tabriz, or Bihzad's corpse may have been transferred back to Safavid-controlled Herat, where he was buried in 1535. Regardless of what constitutes actual events in the life of the man or the myths about him, it is undeniable that the style of Bihzad, or the Herat school, with compositional and figural formulas he helped establish, spread across the Eastern Islamic realm, what I call the Turco-Persianate sphere, in the early modern period. My talk will dwell on Bihzadian reverberations and reiterations in the early arts associated with the Abū'l-Khairid dynasty, administering the centers formerly held by the Timurids in Transoxiana. There, manuscript makers continued late Timurid practices for decades after the broader Timurid collapse in 1507. My present focus is attuned to the ambiguous and insecurely provenanced decade of production in Khorasan and Transoxiana, spanning 1510 and 1520. This period languishes between the better researched workshops of Sultan Hussein Mirza's late Timurid Herat on the one hand, and Keldi Muhammad Sultan's early Abū'l-Khairid Tashkent workshops of the 1520s. The decade is significant due to containing the germinating seeds of Abū'l-Khairid manuscript arts that would later flower in Bukhara between the 1530s and the 1570s. But my study comes with inordinate challenges and obstacles. The visual materials I have grouped all lack a named patron that would assist with identifying a provenance. Many are loose folios that have been ripped from their bindings, thus lacking colophon information that might have offered a time and place of production. Alternately, when there are colophons in an intact codex, the dates only refer to the scribal copying, and this is usually at the tail end of the Timurid period. And if texts include illustrations, then these were added later at an indeterminate time. In these manuscripts, illustrations can also reflect a variety of styles and hands in a single bound work, evidencing various interventions, perhaps in Herat, Samarkand, Tashkent, or rarely Bukhara. Another encountered problem is that when only the name of a scribe is mentioned, some of these individuals are known to have served Timurids, Safavids, and Abū'l-Khairids within a short time span. But grievances aside, the fall of one dynasty and the rise of a new one is a transition of obvious cultural and historical importance, and the changeover between the Timurid and Abū'l-Khairid dynasties in Transoxiana is one such opportunity to trace artistic continuities and departures. So after providing the historical context, I will first overview some particular styles arising in this period, among them what I'm terming the chubby figure style, along with the big figure and the little figure of other scholars' research. However, the bulk of my discussion is going to be on the first illustrated manuscript commissioned by the earliest Abū'l-Khairid military leader, Muhammad Shaybanid Khan, and this is the Fathnameh Khani, or literally the Book of the Khan's Victories. And this is a Persian language versified history modeled on Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. The sole illustrated copy and other manuscripts made well into the next decade demonstrate how artisans and styles that are often classified as late-Timurid also operated in early Abū'l-Khairid contexts and workshops throughout the 1520s. The discussion will delve into the very origins of Abū'l-Khairid arts of the book and their earliest illustrated manuscripts produced harnessing talent in Herat and Samarkand. I hope to nuance and fine-tune research on the site of Bukhara, to which Abū'l-Khairid manuscript production is so often indiscriminately attributed. All the contemporaneous Turco-Persianate dynasties dominating the early modern period, such as the Abū'l-Khairids, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, revered and reinterpreted the earlier Timurid decorative repertoire and historiographic traditions that had created standards of high culture in the previous century. Of all these named dynasties, or those you see on the screen, the Abū'l-Khairids have been overlooked in examinations of cultural forms and artistic productions from the Eastern Islamic realm. Originally a steppe-based society with nomadic traditions, the Abū'l-Khaiриds adopted and perpetuated Timurid manuscript arts as a means to legitimate their rulership over the Islamic sphere they came to administer. The Abū'l-Khaiриds positioned themselves as inheritors of the Timurid heartland in Transoxiana and restorers of Chengiz Khan's original aims. They trace their descent through his eldest son, Jiuqi. The Abū'l-Khaiриds made Samarkand their first capital, supplanting the Timurid court already existing there. Bukhara later rose in significance by the third decade of their administration, but power was shared across other sites known as appanages or governing centers such as Balkh, Tashkent, and Herat, when this important center was periodically taken from the Safavids. The Abū'l-Khaiриds had a self-defined mandate as restorers of Chengiz Khan's original legacy 300 years prior, and they viewed Timurid dynasts as inferior, not having full Chingizid blood, due to Timur's intermarriage with a princess descended from Chengiz Khan's younger son, Chagatai. Transoxiana in the 16th century was a period when religion and politics were intertwined, and Hanafi Sunni Islam in early modern Central Asia was closely connected to Naqshbandi Sufism. The Abū'l-Khaiриds paired genealogy and confession as a legitimation to rule. They also achieved this through directly imitating and extending Timurid artistic patronage practices. So let's start with some historical contextualization. What I hope will be readily apparent is how the last 2 decades of Timurid rule and the first decade of the Abū'l-Khairid administration witnessed instability that accounts for stylistic variety and migrations of artisans. In the second half of the 15th century, tribal groups, Kazakhs and Uzbeks among them, were initially united and led by Abū'l-Khair Khan, who died in 1467, and we see his likeness in the painting on the left from an Abū'l-Khairid manuscript done a century later. They assisted feuding Timurid dynastic claimants to secure control of Samarkand. In exchange, leaders of Abū'l-Khairid troops were granted nominal governance and Chagatai princesses to wed. And again, the Abū'l-Khairids prided themselves on having kind of pure Juchid descent. It was Abū'l-Khair's grandson, Muhammad Shaybanid Khan, featured here on the right, who would break free at the dawn of the 16th century and topple his Timurid overlords. We see him here in a portrait attributed to the painter Bihzad, whom I mentioned at the start of this lecture, was briefly in his service in between Timurid and Safavid employment. And as an aside, Babur, the future founder of the Mughal dynasty in India, accused Muhammad Shaybanid Khan of correcting the very paintings of Bihzad and also the handwriting of Sultan Ali, who was a famous Timurid calligrapher. So he's accused of being quite vain. Muhammad Shaybanid Khan forced the Timurids out of Transoxiana and made these princes begrudgingly relocate to India, where they became the Mughals. But backing up, to the mid-1490s and the state of the arts. The head Timurid monarch, Sultan Hussein Mirza Baiqara, had ceased patronizing manuscripts in Herat, but other political and military elites continued to do so in this decade, such as Baiqara's eldest son, Badi Azaman, who patronized an illustrated copy of Navoi's Khamsa with individual titles now dispersed across Oxford's Bodleian Library and the John Rylands. And so one of these is dated 1495. However, in 1497, as we see here, Badi Azaman and his allies attempted to take Hisar, which is near present-day Dushanbe in Tajikistan. And so this was to be a staging post to then seize Samarkand. But they failed to do so, so that in 1499, Badi Azaman attempted to lay siege to Herat, wanting it for himself and prying it from the grasp of his father. But he was unsuccessful, so that in 1500, his father Baiqara, as a means to appease him, gave him Balkh and much of today's Tajikistan to him. At the start of 1501, Baiqara's esteemed advisor, Ali Sher Nabai, died, but half a year prior to this, in the summer of 1500, the Uzbeks under Muhammad Shaybani had taken Samarkand. And you see this event actually on the right. This is a painting from the Fathnameh, which I will discuss soon. Following the Abū'l-Khairid victory over Samarkand, they took Bukhara and other centers. So we come to, let's see, discuss that, the death of Ali Shah Nabai. We come to 1506. So let's see, between 1501 to 1506, Abū'l-Khairid power in Samarkand would be challenged by the Timurid prince Babur and his troops. But back in Herat, for the remaining 5 years of his life, Baiqara was preoccupied with campaigns in Astarabad and elsewhere in the shrinking Timurid Empire. So all this is to say, the last 2 years of Baiqara's life up to his death in May of 1506 were particularly dangerous for him. Once he was gone, there was a brief and uneasy co-regency in Herat shared between Badi Azaman and his brother Muzaffar Hussein, which lasted only a year until 1507. So at this point, Herat, the pearl of Khorasan, was ultimately taken by the armies of Muhammad Shaybani. It was then that he commissioned the Fathnameh work in response to this victory. Muhammad Shaybani retained Herat until December 1510, at which point Shaybani had his head and one of his hands separated from his body by the Safavid Shah Ismail. And incidentally, my forthcoming article called Remembering the Dismembering is going to be released at some point. The final Timurid dynast, Badi Azaman, fled. The strategic location of Khorasan would continue to be disputed with the Safavids across the entirety of the 16th century, in which the Abū'l-Khairid held power. But in 1511, there was a joint Timurid and Safavid campaign against Muhammad Shaybani Khan's surviving clansmen to take Samarkand for a third time. And it is in this particular campaign that Babur succeeded and held on to the region and oversaw the significant cities of Balkh, Bukhara, and Samarkand. But this wouldn't really last. But at this time, elsewhere in Tashkent, sometime between 1509 and 1518, Kyrgyz-Kazakh rival to the Abū'l-Khairids attempted to take what would become the modern capital of Uzbekistan. So Tashkent, Samarkand, Bukhara, Balkh, all these were in flux after the death of Muhammad Shaybani. 1512 marks, the final expulsion of Babur, and 1514 really marked the end of this tumultuous era in Transoxiana, with the Abū'l-Khairid proving victorious and power divided across various centers. So in sum, all of this is to say that the early Abū'l-Khairid, the early rule was quite precarious. A year after Shaybani's death, every major city that had originally been taken had slipped from Abū'l-Khairid hands due to the combined strength of the Safavids and Babur's proto-Mughal armies. And so these were quite tumultuous times. But as I mentioned, Abū'l-Khairid power prevailed. And so in this new state, power was shared across the main appanages, or these governing centers. Samarkand would be the official capital, to be headed by the Khaqan, or the Great Khan. And so following Muhammad Shaybani Khan's death, this went to his uncle, the eldest Abū'l-Khairid family member, Kuch Kunji, and Shaybani's nephew, Ubaydullah Khan, was granted Bukhara, with Shaybani's cousin, Kildi Muhammad, given Shahrukhiya outside of Tashkent in 1517. So all these three individuals had interests in manuscripts, be they unillustrated Turkic translations of Persian poetry, in the case of Kuch Kunji, or more standard illustrated Turkish and Persian titles. I really try to envision what was happening with artisans and their productions at this time. I find them to be incredibly resilient and resourceful as always, with some personnel remaining in Herat, others dispersed to Istanbul and Tabriz, some joining workshops in Abū'l-Khairid administered Samarkand, some later further going to Bukhara and Tashkent, as we will see, with others also following Babur to Kabul. This brings us to a description of the working environments in late 15th century Herat. The courtly kitabkhane, which is a Persian term for a site of manuscript manufacturing or a site where they are held, had continually evolved since its origins in the Rabi Rashidi complex of the Ilkhanid capital Tabriz. So we see photographs of the ruins today in the Iranian city. So the building was originally from the late 13th century. Complexity in political administration and courtly centralization underpinned this royal kitabkhane model. So actually, this illustration that you see is actually of a madrasa. I'll return to it later, but you see different tasks being carried out. There's the burnishing of paper, there's the copying of texts, there's illustrating, there's transcribing. And so it was really a beehive of activity, if you will. But let's skip over a century to reach our present focus on the Timurid age. Records remain from earlier Timurid kitabkhanes of the 1430s. These mention artisans that were engaged in the production of designs in various media. Another kitabkhane functioning in mid-century Samarkand was also in operation. However, later manuscript production in Samarkand in the late 15th century is not well researched. Rather, the royal kitabkhane of Herat of the 1480s and the 1490s, where Bihzad was employed, is much better documented and seems to have been more active. Scholars assume the institution remained consistent from its Ilkhanid origins. Bihzad initially served under his master, the kitabdar Mirak Naqash Khorasani. In 1486, Sultan Hussein Mirza Baykara appointed Bihzad head of the royal atelier in Herat. So I've thus far dealt with a pretty classic kitabkhane model with top-down an overseer of projects dictating what the projects will be to various artisans. Manuscripts could also be made from the ground up. In this latter environment, fewer artisans were there to complete tasks, or perhaps they reworked manuscripts that were previously transcribed. Timurid sources refer to a courtly kitabkhane as a specific structure in which painters and scribes gathered with other members carrying out projects in different media. This kitabkhane definition is an actual site existing as a singular and formal institution. But this notion of kitabkhane could actually be a bit more conceptual. In this second definition, the kitabkhane is a more plural arrangement with dispersed informal centers being used for the occasional assembly of artisans moving between various ateliers to serve different patrons or execute projects. So I would like to stress, though, that neither a courtly kitabkhane or a temporary concentration of personnel carrying out a project offers more stable employment. Unlike the mentioned Ilkhanid kitabkhane, the one in Tabriz, it seems that Timurid versions of the kitabkhane were in multiple administrative centers in Herat and in Samarkand, and these were not single or centralized organizations. In my next section, we will turn to manuscripts there that are thought to be products of this diffuse model. Members of staff responsible for this output are connected to the court in Herat, but are also somewhat independent of it. I previously mentioned how Sultan Bayqara's patronage ending around 1495 allowed other noble and royal patrons to harness fine talent in the existing workshops. Looking at the corpus of manuscripts made in the 1490s, we can see how the artisans who formerly served Bayqara turned their attention elsewhere. They worked on these illustrations to the aforementioned Khamsa of Nava'i, and so these were made for Bayqara's son Badi az-Zaman, and they have a date of 1495. In the illustration on the left, scholars more or less agree that this could be the hand of Bihzad. The folio on the right carries a signature by his pupil Qasim Ali. Also, in the 1490s, 2 copies of Nizami's Khamsa were made. The first was written out decades earlier. This one has a colophon dated 1442, but Barbara Brenn's recent study attributes its paintings to the courtly Timurid artists Bihzad, Mirak, and Qasim Ali, and one illustration does indeed carry a date of 1490. A second Timurid Nizami Khamsa, seen here, was produced for Bayqara's officer in Herat, Amir Ali Farsi Barlas, and his illustrations are dated 1494. The same mentioned royal painters are attributed to have carried out paintings in this work as well. And it seems, though, there's a signature at the bottom on the left, that this could be the work of Mirak Naqash. These lovely paintings in that Barlas manuscript are attributed to Bihzad. And it's my designation that Bihzad's contributions here accord with the chubby style of figures, which I will discuss next. Thus, we see within the single Barlas manuscript a confluence of artistic abilities and styles. So let's now dwell on the styles that scholars take to be subsidiaries of courtly manuscript production centered in late Timurid Herat, starting with the chubby. Now, this present section will demonstrate how an offshoot of a courtly style used to render compositions and figures can be used in simpler manuscripts produced in tandem with royal workshops and last beyond the life of the dynasty. In this way, the same courtly staff may be responsible for these projects produced later for new elite patrons. So please compare here the lavish Timurid folio on the left from the 1480s with a simpler version on the right from perhaps a few decades later after Timurid power had finished. And I will return to this particular chubby folio later. Or here as well. Based on a similar but simpler composition, such as the undated example on the right, this is from a Mantiqatej in the British Library, following the drying up of Bayqara's royal commissions, it is evident that courtly artists worked on other manuscripts and or trained other artists who copied their figures and compositions. And I should specify that by calling these simpler, I just mean that there are fewer details in the folios. There are fewer illustrations, fewer figures within the illustrations, fewer designs and patternings. So the level of execution is actually quite high. Compare this, how we see a less ornate manuscript in the black and white reproduction on the right. This is a chubby figure illustration that modifies a composition that might have originally been for Sultan Hussein Mirza Bayqara, or a military or political elite. So indeed, this is probably the case with this undated Golestan manuscript in St. Petersburg today. We see how it simplifies the courtly loose folio on the left. The chubby figures appear in manuscripts which, when dated, were written between 1436 and 1523. The figures become modified in appearance in the second decade of the 16th century as illustrations in this style were added to old and newly copied works. Chubby figures adorn this Hafez divan that is our oldest specimen, at least the text is old, since the colophon is dated 1436. The illustrations are not so defined. We don't know when they were added, but we can compare them to other figures in manuscripts that suggest a common workshop or practitioners. To show you this visual similarity, this Hafez manuscript has the old-fashioned and dumpy figures as this manuscript here. And by calling them old-fashioned and dumpy, I'm using the words of the founding fathers of Persian manuscript painting, the Basils, Basil William Robinson and Basil Gray. This is a dispersed Mehr Mushtari manuscript of Asar dated 1523, located in the Smithsonian collection, the National Museum of Asian Art. It was written out by Ibrahim Khalil in Bukhara. Based on the colophon, scholars who have inspected the object assume that the illustrations were contemporaneous to the text, so meaning the illustrations were added in 1523 in Bukhara, and this became an accepted and a repeated attribution. However, I do not believe this to be the case, and I think more research is needed. The manuscript cannot be used as evidence for an organized workshop in Bukhara in the 1520s. One must treat any attributions to Bukhara so soon in the 16th century with skepticism, as Bukhara was a site of religious scholarship and jurisprudence in the preceding Timurid period and earlier. However, it was not known for painting traditions in the Timurid period. There is only limited evidence for a workshop in Bukhara engaged in the production before the 16th century. The city would become an important artistic center after 1529, although it did maintain its religious prestige across the centuries since the very Islamic conquests. Without a concentration of courtly artisans, a workshop in Bukhara could not have formed so quickly with the changeover to Abū'l-Khairid control. So it seems to me much more likely that the chubby figures were painted by artists who had trained and continued to live in Herat between the 1490s and the 1520s. Chubby figures are in a manuscript of Jaimee Subhat al-Abrar in the Khodabakhsh library, and this is a manuscript copied by Sultan Muhammad Nur. It carries a date of March 1508, which is a year after the Abū'l-Khairid had taken Herat from the Timurids. This is associated with May 1507. So if the same artisans had been working on all the manuscripts in the common chubby figure style that was originated by Bihzad for Timurid royals and officials at the end of the dynasty, these artisans remained in Herat and carried on their practice seemingly oblivious to the political changeover. This Khodabakhsh manuscript was written out by Sultan Muhammad Nur, and he is the same scribe as the one who wrote out this Bustan, and it carries the date of 1514 with chubby figures as well. Its separated illustrations are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Sultan Muhammad Nur had first served in Bayqara's Kitabkhane in Herat and remained there to work for the Abū'l-Khairids and then the Safavids overseeing the region. We do not know where he transcribed this particular Bustan, but it could have been Herat or Bukhara, since we know he traveled between these two locales. Sultan Muhammad Nur wrote out the text to a copy of a Tufat al-Ahrar of Jaimee in the splendid city of Bukhara. This is in the colophon, to a manuscript dated a year later in 1515. And so it indicates that he was indeed in Bukhara, in the Abū'l-Khairid appanage there. But shortly after, he returned again to Herat, before leaving as an old man in 1531 to move to a now flourishing Bukhara, where he died in 1536. So, in sum, transit between Herat and Bukhara was a common occurrence for artisans following the death of Muhammad Shaybanid Khan in 1510. But here merits an excursus on Bukhara as a center of manuscript production, or a continuation of my discussion. Abū'l-Khairid arts of the book and their earliest illustrated manuscripts are often indiscriminately associated with Bukhara, even from the inception of the dynasty, but I cannot find ample evidence that there were prolific painting workshops here before 1530. So it's one thing to write out a text in a city, but quite another to have it, very, carefully, illuminated and illustrated as part of some, very structured agenda, structured program. Sultan Muhammad Nur's other texts that I mentioned are evidence of being written out in Bukhara in 1514, 1515, but the illustration I show you here to one of these must postdate 1530. And so this text that he transcribed seems to be an isolated endeavor and not connected to broader production in Bukhara. The earliest reference I have found to a manuscript being produced there in the Splendid City, or this Shahri Fakhire, is an unillustrated Arabic text from the late Timurid period, and this is dated 1491. And so next comes another work dedicated to Muhammad Shaybanid Khan from 1509. But this is a collection of Arabic treatises, and it names the site of transcription as the noble city of Bukhara. So these are all early Bukhara materials, but actually all of these were unillustrated during the first 2 decades of Abū'l-Khairid power. And so this fine folio is added later. So the text was written out first, illustrations added later. I am suggesting that there is a visual dormancy in Bukhara between the 1500s through the 1520s. Texts may have been written out there, but were not illustrated there. This is what I propose for this Mehr Mushtari manuscript I mentioned with the chubby or dumpy figures. And so it seems like things only pick up in Bukhara after the 1530s, but maybe materials were taken back to Herat for artists to illustrate them there. So although they have lost a bit of their paunch, chubby figures frequent a Kuliyat of Navai, copied by Sultan Muhammad Noor's famous teacher, Sultan Ali. And so this manuscript is dated 1521 and was patronized by the Abū'l-Khairid overseer of Shahrukhia and Tashkent, Kildi Muhammad. The illustrations have been analyzed as transformations, yet simplifications of Bihzad. This manuscript demonstrates how artisans and styles that are often classified as late Timurid Herat, such as the chubby figure, also operated in the early Abū'l-Khairid manuscript production sites of Tashkent through the 1520s. As I mentioned, transit between Herat and Bukhara is known to have been easy. Travel between Tashkent and Bukhara even more so, and so this could explain the transfer and repetition of late Timurid chubby figures from Herat redeployed in Bukhara and Tashkent in the 1520s and beyond. So let's move on to the big figure and the little figure styles. Scholars writing in Russian and English have discerned 2 other styles associated with Herat and Samarkand at the cusp of the Timurid and Abū'l-Khairid periods. And so these have been termed non-princely, at least in style, if not in intention and execution, or provincial. And so the reason why I use big figure and little figure is because I'm really indebted to the work of this Turkish scholar Samiha Altair, who uses the terms büyük figürlü üslup, or big figure, and küçük figürlü üslup. She suggests that these 2 styles started around the same time, towards the end of the 15th century, in a second-degree atelier in Herat. This workshop would have functioned in tandem with courtly productions in the same city, but produced simpler works for commercial purposes. With political instability in Herat after the fall of the Timurids around 1500, manuscripts illustrated in the 2 styles have no direct relationship with any dynastic partisans. And so perhaps these were made for new patrons or some surviving Timurids, or those who had found themselves with means in Samarkand and Herat when the sites came under Uzbek rule. The only manuscript that has been found that carries a date with the big figure style is in this copy here, a Mehr Mushtari by Asar, and it's dated 1483. The big figure style is identifiable by having few figures filling a composition. Typically, there are 3 people or less. Each character has long and large elongated body proportions and often wear pointy black boots. So you see the pointed toes, the pointed heels, and background mountains are painted in pastel color schemes. I detect close parallels between the big figure style and paintings attributed to the Timurid kitabdar Mirak Naqash, whom I named earlier. This was Bihzad's mentor and his colleague. As a point of comparison, please note the attendants and the figures within the Barlas Nezami manuscript on the left that I mentioned are attributed to Mirak. Mirak's hallmark is a slightly downturned mouth, and the lower line of his nose really kind of looks like an extended W. The robes worn by Mirak's figures are colorful, and they are held by a belt or a cummerbund. Several figures have handkerchiefs that dangle down on their belts. Turbans are round caps, flat-topped or pointed. All of these elements all of these elements apply to the big figure style. This big figure style has been attributed to the time span between the 1460s and the 1500s, which does accord to Midak's lifetime and his professional years, up to his death during the reign of Muhammad Shaybanid Khan. In the big figure style, we may see how he trained and influenced other artists in his method and techniques to operate outside the courtly Herat Kitabkhane and function in Samarkand. Let's see. Let's move on, if we will, to the little figure style, which overlaps with the big figure style in terms of chronology. And actually, in some instances, these two styles cohabit in the same bound manuscript. The little figure style is characterized by short and squat figures with flat noses, bored-looking faces, and small red lips below thickly outlined eyes. Beasts are not very well rendered. So the style seems to emerge around 1500, immediately at the onset of Abū'l-Khairid regional authority. To Basil William Robinson, the little figure illustrations are unskilled and untutored efforts to imitate Bihzad's Herat style of the time, executed shortly before the Herat painters themselves arrived in Bukhara, where they could teach it correctly, according to him. When colophons are present, so when there are dates in the manuscripts carrying little figure styles, they range from 1497 to 1504. But these dates only refer to the textual scribing. And so it is feasible that manuscripts with the little figure illustrations were made in this window, or perhaps a little bit afterwards, so coming at the end of the Timurid and start of the Abū'l-Khairid periods. The practitioners would become better trained and would work on Abū'l-Khairid manuscripts for administrators in Tashkent, Samarkand, and Bukhara. Works with little figures are accompaniments to Nizami, Navai, Amir Khosrow Dehlavi, and Ferdowsi manuscripts. So they don't seem to be connected to named Abū'l-Khairid patrons. And it doesn't seem like that the Timurid courtly clientele, who were at this point a bit uneasy with the threats to their power, that they would have been interested in commissioning these manuscripts. So rather, the patrons might have been just anybody, or maybe not even patrons. They were made for commercial purposes, catering to anybody who had resources and an inclination to own a classic work of the Turco-Persianate canon of literature. Let me move on. Well, let's see. So these little figure illustrations have been associated as being, proto-Bukhara. And so if the Bukhara style really took off in the 1530s, we see how the little figure kind of was the little seed that could help germinate and take over the Bukharan Kitabkhane, such as in the 1530s. So these are the highlights, the high points of this continued style. But I think it's important to get back to the era of earlier Abū'l-Khairid production. So to the late art historian Ernst Kuhne, the artistic environments that I have been tracking is such that following the fall of Herat to the Abū'l-Khairids in 1507, Bihzad's numerous talented pupils and those outside the workshop of the leading master who were working in the traditional Timurid practices dispersed to various centers, whether these were in the Safed realm or the Abū'l-Khairid political landscape. So they kind of grafted themselves onto these workshops, staying in Herat or Samarkand, Shahrukhiya, Tashkent, or Bukhara. So we've looked at the chubby style, we've looked at the big figure, the little figure style. Let's turn to the Abū'l-Khairid Fathnameh Khani and see how it synthesizes elements of these styles, plus a few others, and spawns a new artistic legacy rooted in Transoxiana. The text to the Fathnameh Khani, or the Khan's Book of Conquests, is in versified Persian, and it chronicles Shaybanid's beginnings in the Dashti Qipchak steppe region, which is in present-day Kazakhstan, and chronicles his capture of Samarkand in 1500. And in it, he's presented as both a warrior and a lover. Upon taking control of Samarkand, pictorialized here, Shaybani Khan sought to chronicle his own deeds. And although there is no colophon present, it seems to be that the Fataname was begun before Herat was taken in 1507. And so there's overall consensus that the pictorial program was added in his new capital in Samarkand between 1507 and 1510. So it's in verse form, as I mentioned. The text really, copies Ferdowsi's style. It presents, the leader as a glorified Shahnameh hero, but it's also taking inspiration from biographies of Timur and Alexander the Great. And so here we see perhaps the formations of, Abū'l-Khairid manuscript arts derived from late-Timurid Herat, so manuscripts from the court of Sultan Hussein Mirza Baykara. This is from the Zafarnameh, and this comparison really shows perhaps the indebtedness of the Fatnameh to this Zafarnameh of Timur's biography. I have multiple examples. We see these kind of crenellated ramparts here, and the siege, the storming of this fortress has, the same composition. Or in here, the depiction of Muhammad Shaybani with his lover, and it kind of echoes this outdoor yurt scene of Timur holding an audience in Balkh. So tracking the full transit of this Timurid Zafarnameh is a topic of another study, but it really seems to me that this work could have inspired the artists, the early Abū'l-Khairid artists. I know the illustrations are a bit abraded and not in the best condition, but the Fatnameh Khani has elements of the Zafarnameh produced for Sultan Hussein Mirza Baykara. In terms of the subject matter, as in the style used to render it, the Fatnameh Khani really conflates the heroics of Shaybani with those of Timur. But let's look at some other elements. So if it's indebted to, elements from, the classic Herat school, there seem to be stylistic connections between the Fatnameh and manuscripts with big figure illustrations. So we see how this kind of sayaban, this umbrella in the black and white folio on the right seems to be echoed in the Fatnameh on the left. Certain stances of the attendants, and there's a chess game going on in the bottom of the black and white illustration, but that kind of has been modified as an outdoor fountain in the Fatnameh scene. Note here Shaybani's warrior posture that might derive from the figure of Isfandyar killing a dragon in the big figure illustration on the right. Or here in these specimens of taken from big figure Shahnameh copies, similar poses and color schema as well. However, I have demonstrated or I have detected how there is another style at play here that is a bit inexplicable to me at present. And that is because I detect elements associated with this manuscript from Turkmen Yazd. It's located in Istanbul in the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Art. And so it has a colophon that says Yazd and a date of 1451. But several of the illustrations are inexplicably echoed in the Fatnameh. And so please notice the figure in red with this cane and the black and white kalpak hat. He seems to appear in the Fatnameh in the lower left corner, the man in blue. We see here in this comparison a close parallelism in the Turkmen Shahnameh and the Fatnameh, visible in the folio where a prisoner is being brought before a ruler. And so the prisoner has his head bent in submission, and there's a flowering Judas tree or an Arghuvan tree that divides the captive from the seated arbiter. And as for battle scenes in the Fatnameh, we see spouting blood, this wonderful detail. And also the rows of helmeted soldiers on horseback and players of the karnai, the long trumpets. Shaybani on horseback on the left stands beneath an imperial red parasol, which is similar to the Iranian warrior in the act of smiting in the Turkmen Shahnameh. So some scholars have already noted a Turkmen connection to the Fatnameh, but they don't really say how. It is very difficult to explain the visual transference between mid to late 15th century Aqoyunlu Turkmen illustrations and those produced in Abū'l-Khairid, Samarkand in the first decade of the 16th century. But we know that artisans have always been very migratory and they go where employment is. So perhaps artists who had worked for Turkmen or Timurid artists left Herat or Yazd and wanted to escape turmoil, so ventured to Shiraz, which would later be administered by Aqoyunlu Turkmens. And so that, for that reason, maybe they carried out some designs and artistic developments that continued to be perpetuated in subsequent decades. So to sum up my formal analysis of the Fatnameh, the work derives inspiration from compositions of the classic courtly Herat style and forms also from the big figure style, but we don't see much in terms of the little figure style represented. Artisans and materials formerly residing in Herat relocated to Samarkand to assist in the production of the Fatnameh. The Fatnameh was not the only thing they worked on in the first decade of the 16th century. The Soviet scholar Muqaddama Ashrafi suggested that Fatnameh miniatures are similar to this undated manuscript of Hatifi's Shirin and Khosrow, and she remarks on these parallelisms: the general decorative structure, the proportions of the figures, the manner of their depiction, the costumes. She says this is the work of the same circle and time, and names Samarkand circa 1507 to 1510. But to this manuscript group of early Abū'l-Khairid origin, likely done in Samarkand, I would extend it to 1507 to 1520. And I would include in it an array of other undated and indeterminate illustrated manuscript materials that are all evocative of late Timurid Herat and early Abū'l-Khairid Samarkand and Tashkent. So some of these folios, especially the ones with the yurts on the right side, are very similar to the Fatnameh, but these are taken from Nezami and Navai manuscripts. And alas, the manuscript on the bottom is in the British Library, so that has a better provenance, but the folio on top is just ripped up and stands alone. Let's see, but looking at this illustration on the left, which seems to be akin to this Fatnameh production, this is a Navai manuscript that carries a seal, and the seal is of the overseer of Tashkent, Keldi Muhammad Sultan, and it carries a date of 1518. So the seal announces the point at which the finished work was in his possession, so it might not have been of his commission. Its illustrations could have been added in Samarkand, or the artists remained in Herat with the downfall of their Timurid overlords. And so perhaps Kildi Muhammad was pleased with their labor and had them invited them to continue their practice and produce other manuscripts when he presided over Shahrukhia and Tashkent later in the decade. So I think I'm approaching the end, but just a few more remarks on manuscripts similarly produced. This is a Kuryat of Navai in the Royal Asiatic Society, and we see that it carries a little figure illustration and also a kind of an homage to the classic Herat school. There is no colophon, unfortunately, but this particular manuscript does carry a rubbed opening shamsa, or a roundel, that carries a legible word. We see it here, al-Khan, which means the great Khan. So between 1500 and 1520, only two men carried this title, Muhammad Shaybanid Khan himself and his uncle, Kuchkunji, after 1514. And so the latter mostly patronized translated Turkic works, and so this is a linguistic proclivity that makes it feasible that he was the owner of this Navai manuscript. So in the absence of cold, hard proof in the form of colophons, dates, and named individuals recorded in the manuscripts, we can construct a stylistic trajectory of early Abū'l-Khairid painting. It moves from the early coarse, little, and big figure styles associated with political pandemonium and dynastic upheaval at the onset of the century. But the Fatnameh also comes before the refinement of Keldi Muhammad's later patronage in Tashkent in the second decade, the illustration on the left. So Muhammad Shaybani Khan's Fatnameh from around 1510 does not exactly mark the start of Abū'l-Khairid painted manuscripts, but is a middle point and part of a longer trajectory beginning in late Timurid Herat. So I wish to conclude. The Abū'l-Khairids in the first 2 decades of the 16th century were preoccupied with consolidating control in the region. At the same time, they managed to create suitable environments for book arts, but not for stylistic unification. This was due to the division of power across different centers and the relocation of mobile artisans, perhaps those trained in late Timurid workshops of Herat. Shaybani Khan had to rely on the talents of his Timurid predecessors to craft his own biographical Khannameh. This is kind of an inside joke to those of you who are familiar with the Shahnameh. So the illustrations to his Khannameh, his Fatnameh, are mainly products of practitioners of the big figure style, that is to say, artists who had formerly worked on commercial Timurid manuscripts in non-courtly Herat workshops, but found employment possibilities to the north in Samarkand and served in this new Abū'l-Khairid center. The artist's mentality might be summed up in the following. Bosses, be they Timurid or their Abū'l-Khairid rivals, come and go, but the need for employment stays the same. Thank you.